Good morning, Matthew Skelton. Thank you so much for joining me on Spilling the Product Tea with Leah. Uh, we're just going to kick it right off. Can you introduce yourself? Who is Matthew Skelton? Why should we listen to you?
Hi, thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here. So I am best known at the moment as the author of the book Team Topologies, and that looks, for those of you watching the video, it looks like this. It's a very brightly coloured cover. There's another copy there. Um, Published in September 2019 by IT Revolution Press. Um, I'm also the founder at Conflux, and we help organizations become more effective at organizing and operating for fast flow.
Amazing. Let me introduce you back to yourself and also for the audience, because that makes them also understand what your relevance is in case they actually do not know your book or you. So about 2 years ago, we entered hypergrowth mode in the company that I'm working at Small PDF. And that usually means that you have to scale your organization. You have to grow a lot, right? And we're a typical tech company. So quite boring in the sense. And my CPO recommended me 2 years ago a book. The book that you held into the camera, I was also ready to hold it into the camera, Team
Yeah,
Topologies. That must make you proud that people have this copy running around everywhere, right? So he
it's been
recommended me this
amazing to
book.
see. I mean, we can talk about that in a bit, maybe, but it has
Yeah,
certainly been amazing to see, and yeah, I do feel proud that
yeah,
our work's been useful.
that is really cool. That must be a really cool feeling. I will never write a book. Well, maybe I will, but like people cannot hold up podcasts into the cameras. Anyways, so he recommended this book to me 2 years ago. And what happened, not as a result from the book, but I started to develop this really weird interest. One of the two that I'm super passionate about and also try to focus on. And one of them is organizational scaling, and the other
Mhm.
one is product led growth. And I find organizational scaling a super interesting market for two reasons. And your book is addressing this in a very good sense. It's an impossible to solve problem perfect. You can just reduce the problems that are coming with it. And it is so highly individual that it is so difficult to give actionable advice on it, right? Like there's a lot of books on organizational scaling and how you should build them. But I feel like advice that is actionable that you can actually use and understand why things are the way that they are very rare. And your book is, for me, one of the best in this space because I felt like I do understand. It's not just like one of those where you get an idea of like, okay, this is what I should do, but I don't really understand why it's happening. It comes from generic advice like Conway's Law to fast flow, but you're very specific in terms of like how the teams should be built and how should they also influence each other, and that organizational structure is not how people are talking with each other, and so forth and so forth. And I love this because it also gives me a lot of stuff to write about and to understand. And yeah, so what usually happens for me is that product led growth is being mentioned. Hey, Leah, we need to do this, and then I tell them, well, you need a reorganization because it just doesn't scale anymore. So yeah, was that more or less accurate in how you hear it also from other people?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Um, so that the the book came out of I can kind of trace it back to a blog post I wrote, which is still on my blog on matthewskelton.net, and it still gets loads of traffic, even though I wrote it in 2013. I was working at an organization at the time, fairly typical um, kind of online type company, selling stuff online, and relatively small. I think there was about 400 people in the company at the time,
Mhm.
and there were some challenges. It was so back in like when I joined in 2011. Uh, Quite typically, they had some stuff in the data center and they're moving to the cloud. And so there's kind of lots of challenges around new technologies, new approaches, thinking about teams, thinking about automation, a whole bunch of this stuff. Um, and there was a point there where we were having discussions about the responsibilities between sort of like the engineering or development teams and the operations teams who are looking after stuff in production. So really, really standard stuff. What at the time was called DevOps. DevOps means something different now, but that was the nature of what we called DevOps at the time. And I started thinking, and I started putting together some different possibilities for these two groups, how they could work together in an effective way, and really started thinking about different shapes of the organization, different team responsibility boundaries. Um, when is it good to work closely together? When is it more effective to have a nice clean separation, and all this kind of stuff. And that then emerged into a set of patterns that ended up being called DevOps team topologies patterns. So thinking about effective working together between development and operations. Again, this is nearly 10 years ago now. And it became really well used and appreciated by lots of organizations. Like Netflix used it, and Condé Nast International, big publishing house, used it, and so on and so on. Use these patterns. You can still go there. If you search for DevOps topologies, you'll find the website. Kind of like Venn diagrams showing overlaps or no overlap of
Yeah.
responsibility and this kind of thing. And
Yeah.
it seems to be really useful because it's like a way of thinking about it, like you presenting different options and saying, in this context, this would be great, or in this context, you'd get this out of that kind of approach. Here are the limitations of this approach, or the limitations of that approach.
Yeah.
And so it became a bit of a visual language as well for kind of talking through different options, basically helping people to think it through.
Yeah.
And then we did some more work on that. We did some work for a big international kind of telecoms and manufacturer, where they were looking to get some patterns for like 70,000 engineers worldwide and stuff like this, and a bunch of other things. Sort of consulting experience. We pulled it together, and then we decided to write the book. And we approached IT Revolution, home of the DevOps Handbook and Phoenix Projects, and some of these big, really influential books. And it fitted right in. And so we're super happy to be part of that IT Revolution family.
Yeah.
Gene Kim and his team have done just an amazing job at kind of at help pulling together a family, like a collection of books that work really well together. So
Yeah.
we're very proud to be part of that family. And we're now just over 3 years on since publication, and we've been really pleased with the take up. It seems like yes, as you said, the kind of language and ideas and patterns are people can use them. People can take them and use them inside the organization because they're quite practical.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're not too restrictive. It's not like use this spreadsheet or use this flowchart. We tried to, and I think we've succeeded in embedding some core operating principles at the team and in kind of individual and team level, which then people can understand why it benefits them, because by adopting the kind of team topologies, interaction modes and team types, we're providing clarity at a kind of quite a low level in the organization.
Yeah.
And so there's buy-in from people on the ground and all the way up.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a key part of the success is to make the purpose of this approach really clear at multiple different levels. And I think that feels like part of the reason it's been well adopted.
I think this really hits the nail on the head. What makes this problem so difficult to address in the first place? And I have also a note to what you just said, but like I think understanding why these motions happen in this way in the company, or like why a specific team needs to be supported, is much more important than a spreadsheet on here's how the organization should look like in the end. Because as you said, or like I think as you implied as well, it's you need to have buy-in. You need to have also alignment in the entire company. It's not enough if you just run this through the CEO. Like this is a motion, and this goes from small companies to big companies, all the way through. And I can also say as a practitioner, so if you're one of these sinners that are listening to this that does not have this in your bookshelf, get the book. I think it's a great entry to really understand, really from any size of the company. This is what I really appreciate, because I think Matt Greenberg said this also in one of my shows, in the sense that as you're scaling, your processes will keep breaking again. And that's the thing, right? Like you also talk about Dunbar's number and that kind of stuff, which is also important to understand every time you add another 150 to, like to completely oversimplify the problem right now. But every time you add another 150 to the mix, 150 people, your stuff is just completely breaking down. And it's better you understand why it is happening and what you can do against it. So you mentioned an article before that was very DevOps oriented, interestingly. And this was written at a time where I would wager that most of the products that we created were done in engineering organizations, right? So like they were engineering led. Usually you have founders in the company. They're very engineering focused. And what I see now is that we started to shift into a more product focused organizations, like less engineering focused. But the problems are still the same because these companies are still around. You still have these engineering constructs, and now they need to move and they need to enable everything. They need to get up to speed. So I think I'm looking at your book more as a product help book, right? For me as well,
Mm.
because it enables us to actually deliver what has an impact, which is the product. And yeah, so maybe just I just wanted to mention this for those that do not have the book. It's really good to understand some of these mechanics underneath. I mean, you're trying to offer a very specific solution, and you're talking a lot about fast flow and so forth. So we can get into this in a second, but maybe just really quick to touch on. There's a second book that you added on top of this, and maybe you can also talk about it, why this was relevant. So, like, I think it's pretty obvious with COVID and the remote
Yeah, yeah,
work. Why did you feel it was necessary to also add a second book? What is the value that I'm getting out of the second book on top?
sure. I should mention just briefly, actually, we did actually win an award for, I think we were in the top, yeah, we won an award for the best product management books of all time
There you go.
from
Boom.
Book Authority for the original book,
Yeah.
because people could see that actually the it's not just about organization, it's about the dynamics, it's about how teams interrelate, it's how teams think about building things, it's giving people terminology and language to help think about purpose and mission inside the organization. And that stuff is very, very relevant to product, right? Because there's
Yeah.
no way you're going to succeed at product unless you've really got a lot of those things sorted out. So I think it Team Bodies crosses multiple different perspectives, or helps to provide some patterns and approaches for multiple different kind of perspectives inside an organization that is building and running something with software, basically. Now, September 2019 is when the book came out. That's, of course, just a few months before the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And what we realized in over the coming year or so was that there was a need to be like specific about how some of the patterns in Team Bodies apply to remote working. And so that's where we came up with the Remote Team Interactions Workbook. So for those of you in video, it looks a bit like this. It's the design of the cover is very similar to the original Team Topologies cover, deliberately, right? And what we've done, it's quite short.
Mm-hmm.
What we've done is take the Team Topologies ideas and apply these specifically to remote working. So when people are not co-located, when we're only using video call, chat tools, documents, online collaboration portals, whiteboards, this kind of thing, when that's our primary way of interacting, what are some ways that what are some things we can use from Team Topologies to help us in that endeavor? And of course, it actually turns out that the vast majority of stuff inside the original Team Topologies book is completely applicable. We just have to kind of translate it into an online context. In particular, the idea of the team API translates really well. So API is a engineering or technical term meaning application programming interface. So it's effectively a specification of how one computer can make a request or call to another computer using services. And what we've done is take that very technical concept and applied it around a team, because ultimately, for lots of reasons, including things like Conway's law, but other reasons too, it turns out that having a clear specification around what a team does helps hugely in terms of mission, purpose, setting expectations about how this interaction with another team should happen, how long should it go on for, what we're doing here, when are we going to finish this interaction or this collaboration, and so on. And thinking with some intent and with some clarity about our long-term purpose and our short-term purpose, and defining that as an API, team API, really, really helps. And it particularly helps in a remote context, because we can go and look at a team's team API and go, they're expecting to do this, this, and this. Okay, in that case, I'll update my expectation about what we need to do, how we need to interact with them. And you can do that asynchronously.
Yeah.
Without having to have some big chat or negotiation. So done well, when we're using the Team Topologies patterns well and effectively and in a sensible way, then it really does seem to help with remote or hybrid working too.
Yeah, I absolutely love this analogy, and I also want to make a second case for it. I think usually the way that I also explain APIs is that the API is the waiter in the restaurant where you put your orders and they're translating it into an order for the kitchen, and then they deliver the food, right? They're kind of your service person. And I think exactly what you said, it is very important that we know how to interact with, through the waiter, with whoever we're placing the orders. And I just read a very interesting article on LinkedIn the other day, where this not only goes into teams but also C levels. So for instance, there was I think it was a CMO that was talking about, she has a document that she brings into any new organization that says how to work with Lily. I don't remember her name, I'm really sorry, but like, and it is nothing else than a document that says, before you set up the meeting, don't surprise me with stuff like this and that, right? This is how you work
Mm.
with me best. This is what I like to see in a meeting. You know, like for instance, an agenda with very actionable points. Do I need to prepare that kind of stuff?
It's a specification. It's setting some expectations, right?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
we are so different. And also teams are behaving like people in the sense that I love the idea. I really love it. But the interesting thing is that, and I don't know whether you have an input on this, but like I see that people are behaving different if they think about themselves versus as a team. Because as a team, I think it's very easy to get buy-in for your idea. It's great. Here's the team. Here's how you can work with us. But as a person, you start to feel awkward. It's like, you know, do people find this weird if I do this? So I really love this idea from actually doing it from the C level, because then people they see like, hey, this is cool. I should do this too. And also like, if you do this successfully with a team, then other teams will also start to adapt to it. I think it's a great idea. And as you said, sometimes we forget to define like how we should speak with each other. What is the language that we should communicate, and what we
Yeah, the
prefer?
language and expectations, and
Yeah.
effectively the experience of communicating with the groups, and effectively that's what Team Topologies is providing, right? Is providing a set of enabling constraints
Hmm.
to help coherent behavior emerge from a complex adaptive system. It's not the only enabling constraint that you want in place, but it's some,
Yeah.
and it seems like they go quite a long way.
Yeah.
Um, you need other constraints as well. You need things like work in progress limits. You need things about mission
Mm.
and user centricity and a whole bunch of other things. Fine, but certainly at the kind of inside the middle of the organization, where we're talking about teams working together, where we're thinking about dependencies, where we're thinking about flow, the patterns from Teams Bodies seem to provide a set of constraints which go
Yeah.
quite far. And I think that's certainly how I see it now. That's what I realized we did is it's some constraints and patterns that help coherent behavior to emerge.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about in your book about fast flow. I know this also, you kind of already answered it a little bit, but can you maybe explain what you mean with fast flow? Because it's also something that you mentioned on the cover itself, like preparing teams for fast flow. For someone that never heard about this, can you maybe just really tap into what is fast flow and what problem should it address?
Fast flow is a situation where we're making changes to software enriched services multiple times a day. So contrast that with what you might call slow flow, which was the industry norm going back 15, 20 years. When I started my career in software, so I started my career building software for brain imaging machines. That was like 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now. Back then, the nature of software development in most organizations was very different from what it is today. Very, very, very different. We'd build some stuff. We'd decide we're going to make a release. We'd release it onto a CD-ROM, burn it onto CD-ROM, ship it physically in the post, and it would get installed somewhere. And a lot of the mentality of people involved in building and running software services even still today, particularly in management, has this assumption that we kind of build some software and then we're done and we ship it. And then we don't need to care or think about the effect after that. And then we do another phase and we build some more. Actually, if you had like an extraterrestrial looking down at Earth, looking at the state of software development now in 2022 and beyond, what they would see is software as a continuous thing. We're continually evolving these services on a daily basis and making multiple changes every day. That's the starting point. And this continuous aspect of software development across a huge number of different disciplines and areas of life should be our starting point, not this sense in which we can get something finished. And it changes a huge amount about how we need to approach it. And Um, and therefore, we need to, if we're going to be doing this continuously, we need to think about how we're going to sustain an approach to kind of building and evolving that service or product. We need to think about the humans that are involved. We're not just treating them as resources to burn out and expect a load of attrition and things, because you're losing domain knowledge and you're effectively losing your competitive advantage by doing that. So how do we actually have an approach to building and running these things which is sustainable, if you like, with a small s, that the organization can sustain it, and potentially for a long period of time. The digital services that are coming online now, we're talking about long-term savings and banking. We're talking about pensions. We're talking about long-term healthcare. These start to then actually have an effect on people's lives. If we're building a service like a government service that provides welfare payments to someone, if the way in which that service has been built means that a welfare payment goes missing and doesn't land in that person's bank account, they might literally starve because they don't have enough money to buy food. So the kind of software we're building now is increasingly life and death, and I mean that literally now. And so we have a responsibility to adopt and think about ways which help to make the evolution of these software enriched services more kind of sustainable and reducing the likelihood of error and things, because we're thinking about how humans work with these services, how humans build and test and diagnose these services. And for me, that's actually a really important aspect.
Yeah, I can relate so much also to the comment about CD-ROM shipping. I think I entered the industry in 1998, the very first time. This is when Google started to also come on the place. We had internet. So just for people who also are listening to this that are younger, there was a time without internet for us. And, like mobile bills that were racked up to $400 per month and stuff. But I think what you said is really beautiful, because I see two sides to this equation that has changed dramatically. As stupid as it sounds, but I think back then we did not really develop products for people, right? Like we did not really think
indeed.
about...
We developed products because we were developing a product. It was very, very...
Exactly. The product was the reason for building it in some way. And because you said it was not as easy for us to ship a hot fix. It's just like, whoops, it doesn't work, right? We just shipped 100,000 copies of this in a newspaper. You cannot just recall it in this way. But I think if I had to summarize this, at some point in development, and I would say like 5 to 10 years ago, no, maybe 10 years, 15 years ago, what happened is that we have admitted defeat to the complexity of predicting development. This is something like we gave up with waterfall. I've been in so many sales-led companies where we just tried to, like you have these specification documents that are 40, 50 pages long. We've all done them at some point. We're trying to okay, this is how the product looks. And it's unbelievable to think about how this is today. There was no customer on this. We built the entire thing. It was automated. We built systems without having people exposed to it. And then surprise, surprise, it comes completely different. And as you said, if you need to iterate fast and you're trying to focus on people, you just have to admit you have no idea what's going on, also in your organization, but also with the product and the people that are using it. And that's why I think systems are so important that are facilitating this. So just to pivot this a little bit, because I have this framework in my mind that I created for myself through books and other people, maybe also like you, but also from books like Team of Teams, where if people ask me, what are the main pillars that you need to have a successful organization? It always comes down to three things for me. The first one is to have transparency all the way through as much as is possible, from top to bottom. And transparency can be towards the product, can be towards the metrics that you have in the company. What am I influencing? What is my impact? And so forth. The other one is to give autonomy to teams. And the last one is to be accountable for what you do. And I don't mean like checking people. It's just more like, hey, let's have an honest conversation about where the team is standing, and then we need to pivot. And I think, I don't know whether you ever thought about it this way, but like I'm thinking about it this way. And I think your book is really, I know that's not the purpose of it, but like it really addresses these 3 points really well. It seems to work really well if we make teams independent, that they gain autonomy, of course. And for good autonomy, you need to have a really good also information flow. It's not just developing fast, but you need to know what's going on, because only if I know fast what's happening with the product, I can also react fast with something meaningful that actually has impact. And I think that's the way that I'm looking at it. So there's not a direct question attached to this, but I think your book really excels in this way, or like the way that you're thinking about it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think the principles for me, I think, are related but ever so slightly different. I talk about alignment, alignment in mental models, alignment in to the flows of change. Um, we've also got kind of fast
Mm-hmm.
flow as a principle, so trying to prioritize flow above coordination, for example. So historically, lots of organizations have many armies of managers trying to coordinate things because that's what they think is needed. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
actually, if we flip it around and have those managers actually focusing on flow, unblocking flow, looking for where boundaries are not good for flow and jumping on that and trying to improve it, we'd be in a much better place in the context where we need fast flow, which is, I think, most business organizations and most kind of government services and this kind of thing do need rapid flows of change. There are some situations where we don't need that, which is fine. Maybe like research and development and a few other places like palliative care, end of life care, stuff like this. We don't need it in the same way. But the situations that do not need fast flow are you know
Yeah.
kind of few and far between, really, if we're going to be honest. And so flow as a principle, alignment as a principle, and um, thinking about the human aspects of the people building the software. And that's where we sort of introduced or at least we popularized the idea of team cognitive load as an architectural driver
Mm-hmm.
for organizations. Like, think about the cognitive load that we're placing on people inside these teams. If we exceed the cognitive limit of that team, they're not going to be able to look after that software effectively. You're effectively increasing business risk by pushing more and more stuff onto them. Let's actually be realistic about where the risk in the organization lies by actually trying to make team-sized services, trying to limit the size of services that teams work with to the cognitive load they can handle. Because if you push more and more stuff into the team, then something will break, and all you're doing is hiding the business risk. So why
Yeah.
would you want to do that? And I guess the final pillar, so I might have 4 pillars, I guess, is thinking about decoupling. And so one aspect of decoupling is that you end up with autonomous teams that need to make decisions, and that's really valuable for sure. That's the General Stanley McChrystal in Team of Teams talks about that and why and how that worked for them. In that, it's a great book. But there's some interesting properties of scaling, which I'm sure you're aware of if you read that book, Scale, by Jeffrey. What's the surname? It's behind me.
I don't know. Like, I'm trying to look now in my shelf.
I think it's Jeffrey Moore. Anyway, it's a book that literally it's just called Scale, and it talks about the different the ways in which different things actually scale, like cities and blood vessels in a dinosaur and a blue whale, and a bunch of other things, how they scale. There's some repeated sort of universal scaling laws, and if you look at many organizations scale in a way which means that they get much less and less effective as they get bigger. But there are 1 or 2 organizations that, as they scale, they get more and more effective. And the examples are like Haier, the Chinese manufacturer, and Amazon. Certainly, Amazon AWS. They as they scale, they actually get more and more effective. And there's something different about how these organizations have organized themselves, and principles around decoupling, principles around team autonomy, which make them, as they get bigger, they don't get more cumbersome. They get less cumbersome as they get bigger. They actually get more and more effective. And so I think the decoupling thing has been really interesting for me to explore over the last year and a half, because it turns out that there's not many people thinking about talking about the decoupling that's actually needed for large scale, which is decoupling in time. So if you think about product development in lots of organizations, you might have one team building something, and they say, in order for us to finish this feature, we need this database or this API updated. So, hey, API team, can you go and update that? And they'll say, yeah, that's fine, but we need this database change. And the database team will say, well, to do that, we need to scale the database. So then you've got a chain of 4 or 5 different groups that all need to do something in order to get this thing out. And a lot of people see that as normal. And what I've come to realize that this is actually abnormal. It's not how the real world actually, it's not how things work in nature. It's not how scaling actually works effectively in terms of evolution and things. And we need approaches that move well away from that kind of coupling in time. Topologies helps with that. It doesn't explicitly address it because we weren't trying to address that. But if you take some of the team topologies patterns and think about kind of team autonomy and think about what that true autonomy means, if you've got true autonomy, then you would be able to say no to another team that's asking for something from you. You say, actually, no, we're not going to do that right now because it's going to hurt what we're doing. We hear you. We see that's a really valuable thing, but we're not going to do it right now. Perhaps we'll put it on our backlog, or perhaps we can explore the details of this thing you're requesting next week. And I think there's some important aspects of autonomy there, which, again, lots of organizations haven't really explored. And that's to their detriment, because if you really start thinking about kind of aligned autonomy and the implications of that, it changes the operating model of the organization hugely. But in a way which has amazing benefits, like you get this super scaling effect, like we've seen in Amazon and higher.
No. I think that's a fascinating thought, because I also think that smaller companies that just went through a growth phase understand what you just said intimately much better, because they've just been in a structure where they kind of had this, right? So like in some ways, what we are trying to do is to preserve what you have in a 5-man, 5-woman startup, which is perfect alignment. Everybody's on the same line. Everybody knows what's going on. There's no organizational friction. There is no need for separation as well, I guess, because, the scope is big enough. It's easier to prioritize. And I think that's quite interesting, because I see this, like, there's way less buy-in necessary on the smaller scale, of course. I think, at least that's what I'm experiencing. I don't have experience with huge companies like you do, of course. But I think this is really fascinating, because you also speak about it in your book, and it's also something that I quote quite a lot, is the Conway's Law, in this sense, is really full force in this regard. Like, if we have just this example that you made with, I have a request, and then it goes through 2 other teams. These other teams have their own OKRs, their own goals. We're separated between this thing. And then you could say, well, yeah, but that's normal, right? Like, we have dependencies into other teams, and it's kind of what it does, right? It's just like how it works. I understand that, but the problem is, if you make it hard for people to work, they will behave like water after some point, and then they don't make the request in the first place anymore, and then they will deprioritize a change, even though it would make sense, because it's just hard to do. I don't want to work with this team. This team never delivers. And one of my favorite examples that I always bring up in every podcast episode in a different context, and now I can bring it up perfectly, is marketing. So there is this movement happening, at least in my head, where marketing is, in all organizations, responsible for top of the funnel changes. They come in, they do paid advertising, you're trying to get a lot of people, but you're only taking care so much of the product's journey. Like, you bring people in and then you kind of forget about them. Sales is also just like a motion to bring accounts on the revenue sheet, and then we don't touch them anymore. What we are trying to do, and that goes perfectly in what you said, is that we want people to be responsible for everything of the buyer's journey, for a very small segment or a very specific segment where you can have autonomy, right? Like, I want to take care as much of this particular customer's journey as I can. So we want to give more autonomy to marketing teams. But at the same time, we don't want to bloat up the teams or whatever the future structure is. And I find this a fascinating discovery, because that means that marketing has to rethink how they're working, sales has to rethink how they're working, and product also has to open up, because it goes a little bit into your direction as well of how organizations should function in the future, because it's not anymore function, right? My biggest nightmare is to see matrix organizations. That gives me the creeps, exactly for this particular reason, because we're separating people by function. And it just does not work. Unless you're giving me now a reason to believe in matrix organizations, but for me, they're dead.
No, I mean, Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree. I mean, there are some organizations that seem to do something that looks a little bit like Matrix, but the devil's in the detail, right? Some um, um, like the who is the person that you can not report to, but who's the person that you can turn to in the organization for kind of help and support with developing your career, or if there's some kind of some awkward personnel problem, like who would you turn to in that situation? So there's all that
Hmm.
side, but then in terms of your performance as an individual, well, the performance as an individual inside an organization is limited anyway by the system that you're working in. So any kind of obsession with individual performance, it needs to recognize that if you've done something really good and you've really put some effort in, it needs to the organization should recognize that. But the idea that we only measure individual performance is feels
Yeah.
very outdated, and we should be looking at team performance and ways to make teams more effective. And of course, that's then aligned to the team goals and to the stream of change and so on. So it changes how we think about sort of performance across the organization, really.
Hmm. No.
Um, but I've certainly, going back to the stuff about kind of silos, I've seen some incredibly damaging behaviors from organizations that have a separate sales team, and the sales team is particularly if you're getting into a kind of product death spiral. So we worked with one organization where they had a really successful product about 15 years ago, got loads of customers on board, didn't invest at all in kind of updating it,
Hmm.
and didn't really see software engineering as an important thing. They just thought it was like a few kids like writing a few scripts, and they saw that the main purpose of the organization was kind of to have good sales calls with the
Hmm.
account heads, or the accountants having good sales calls with the customers, bring in those deals, and then basically trying to squeeze product as much as possible, like reduce the cost and reduce the headcount and all this kind of stuff. Not seeing that actually they're on a death spiral because their market share is dipping. They're not investing in the new ways of doing things. And sales is promising stuff which is actually physically impossible for anyone to deliver. You simply can't do this thing. You can't do that kind of whatever it is, data comparison. You can't do that kind of you can't get that kind of performance on the technology that you're using. It's just never going to happen. The laws of physics don't allow it, and yet sales have promised that. And that
Hmm.
kind of sales and product or sales and engineering silo is mad. It leads to a kind of a hugely negative situation
Hmm.
where one part of the organization doesn't trust another part, and you've got all these kind of promises that are being made but that are never going to get fulfilled, and so on. And so having some sort of alignment so that sales are acting in much more long term. So if you're going to sell this thing, then you need to be around to see that through until that thing is delivered, and then and you've got some customer feedback, not just hey, you've sold this thing.
No.
So the kind of long term viability of what the organization is doing, this starts to point actually to what's really behind team topologies and similar
Hmm.
approaches, like books like Empowered by Marty Kagan and so on and so on, which is for too long, many organizations have essentially been way too kind of sort of bureaucratic mini fiefdoms with separate functional silos running their own things. And as you said at the beginning, the software that we're building has not been designed for users. It's been designed as a piece of technology. I mean, there's been
Hmm.
some exceptions, right, where people have had they've been really good user centric and user experience focused.
No.
I think Microsoft Excel had some input around that, but if we're not obsessing about the kind of customer outcomes, then we
Hmm.
get to all sorts of these weird local optimization problems, like sales selling all sorts of stuff which is physically impossible.
Yeah.
And by thinking about products, by thinking about services and streams of value, and by trying to align teams and money effectively to these streams, we end up having really important conversations about the mission and purpose of the whole organization and of different parts of the organization. Now, that gets hard because some people find that very difficult because it's quite clear that the mission and purpose of their part of the organization isn't actually very effective right now.
Yeah.
But if you think about from like an exec perspective or the CEO needs to have those conversations because otherwise the organization probably won't exist in 5 years' time. And so a lot of these books, like Team Topologies and Empowered and so on, they're helping more and more organizations to have these difficult conversations about mission, purpose, kind of customer outcomes, which is whoever the customers are, whether they're paying or whether they're citizens using a government service. That kind of thinking and centricity is really starting to help make the more switched on organizations more effective.
Yeah, yeah. This is exactly the perfect theoretical explanation of what you've just given for product-led sales and the way we're thinking about it as well. I love that you also described it as a medieval concept, like fiefdoms. Now, I'm not a native English speaker, but in my head, that's a medieval word. It's great. I love it. Like the only thing that's missing is like you have the manager being described as dukes and duchesses and whatever, and like royalty. But I think you're right on the money there, especially if we talk about product-led sales. So let's say we change the way that we sell our products and we want to make sales care about the entire journey. This is not a reorganization that can happen from a sales leader. It needs to happen on the organizational entire company level, because one of the problems is, so let's say we want to sell products and give the salespeople usage data. So how do people use it? Are they actually successful? So like, let's say we want to do this. We need to change the incentivization model. This one we can do internally. You're not going to be incentivized on the size of your account, but on the expansion, whether your customer is successful, however that looks. That's fine. But now, if you need to have data, I don't know a single salesperson that writes their SQL. Maybe I do, but like, they have already trouble getting to the data. So now you need a BI tool that also is giving you the data in some meaningful way that you can actually act on it. And then we need to qualify, what does it mean to have a successful customer? Because I don't want my salespeople to do outbound calls anymore, but really just approach people who are showing signs of interest. They have used the product 1,000 times in the last 10 days or whatever, and so forth. So, and this is, I really want to drive this home for anyone that's listening here in that sense. If you want to do changes like this, if you hear about product-led growth or product-led sales, this is not a motion that happens in product or in sales. This is a company thing, and you need to have the right organization for it. And no matrix organization, because it just does not work with this much friction. So I could not agree with you more. Unfortunately, we're getting closer to the end of this episode. I absolutely hate it right now that we're not having more time. So I would like to, if that's okay, let's just conclude on this topic. Let me ask you a more broad question. What do you believe is going to be maybe the most exciting trend coming up in the next 5 to 10 years? Is there something where you believe like, okay, this motion is just going to amplify? Of course, we also see that companies have to deal more with on the efficiency side rather than just growth. Is there anything that you're passionate about that you would bet on and say that Matthew Skelton is betting on this? And I don't mean a stock. I just mean like a trend, something.
Well, I know for a fact that two things. I know for a fact that we're going to see tools emerging that help organizations with their kind of organizational operating system, if you like, call it like an operating system, operating model, but tools that are going to help organizations reason about what they're doing, reason about the shape and size of teams, reason about the team interactions. Tools are emerging in this space basically now. And that's using some of the ideas from Team Topologies, but also from elsewhere as well. Helping leaders to take a more informed and kind of deliberately constrained approach to thinking about evolving the organization. So we're pulling data from version control commits like Git, and pulling data from anonymized data like metadata from Slack channels or Teams channels about which teams communicate with other teams and so on, and using that not in a creepy way, because there will be some creepy versions of this that come out, but they already exist. Like Microsoft's tooling is just horrendous, but there'll be some non-creepy versions. There are some non-creepy versions of this emerging, which feel empowering to teams and which help teams to have better conversations, and where people feel like this is a really positive thing for them, because they can then use these tools to detect, oh, actually, yes, we expected to collaborate with that other team for a week. Turns out it looks actually like we've been having to collaborate for about 3 weeks. Something's wrong here. Can we work towards a clearer boundary? Can we get some help from someone else to help reshape the boundaries here, or maybe we're missing some capabilities or whatever? It can help to accelerate those kind of conversations and provide a pointer to those organizations. So it's a bit like telemetry, a bit like how we've over the last kind of 20 years we've the telemetry and logging and metric space for software applications has just exploded and has been amazing,
Yeah.
and really helped to design better software. I think we'll see kind of telemetry and design tooling coming together to help design and evolve a better organization, one that's more effective, one that's more aligned to fast flow. That's
Yeah.
already happening. So I think that I know that will emerge. I don't know whether it's going to
Amazing.
explode, but
Yeah.
that's already emerging.
That's great. That's a great point. I'm just going to add one sentence to this. If I would have told someone in sales 15 years ago that there will be tools that listen in on you, AI, just to analyze how you can also sell better, I can give BI interaction, they would have been creeped out. But I think this is going to happen because you can explain people that, look, it will make you more successful. It's not about checking your work. It's not, these tools to increase communication are not to check or give control. As you said, it's less about coordinating, it's more about flow and alignment. And I hope this is a great statement to end the podcast. I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great.
One of my best episodes so far. I hope I think about it also afterwards. And thank you so much. And
Great.
hopefully
Thank
this
you.
was not the last time.
Yeah, happy to be back.